President Biden is expected to easily win today's primary, but Michigan governor and Biden campaign co-chair Gretchen Whitmer acknowledged that a large portion of the electorate will not vote for Biden to protest his handling of the Israel-Hamas war.
I think there will be a sizable number of votes for uncommitted. I think that it is every person's right to make their statement about what's important to them.
The uncommitted organizers have said that they want to get at least 10,000 votes. Do you think they'll reach that?
I think that that's possible, yeah.
President Biden has seen significant backlash in the state from its Arab American and Muslim American population, as well as some young progressive voters. We should note Governor Whitmer will join us later this morning on Morning Joe. Joining us now, White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Sabrina Siddiqui. Sabrina, good to see you again this morning. So the president faced a little bit of a protest vote in New Hampshire. Viewers will recall some people there were encouraged to write in ceasefire instead of the president's name, and that amounted to next to nothing. Today feels much more sizable, and I know you've been focusing on it for quite some time. So give us the lay of the land. What should we, and President Biden, expect in Michigan today?
Thanks for having me. Well, I think first and foremost, President Biden will comfortably win the Michigan primary. There's no question about that since he's facing minimal opposition. But as you point out, there is this effort to get voters to cast their ballots as uncommitted. And Michigan is the state with the highest number and percentage of Arab Americans in the country. And those who have been frustrated by President Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas war, and specifically the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, are using this as an opportunity to really warn the president that he does not currently have their vote. And barring a significant change in policy, they are likely to either vote third party or stay at home in November. It's not that they're planning to vote for former President Trump, but, you know, I think that the margin that this effort is looking toward is having at least 10,000 uncommitted votes. That was Trump's margin of victory in 2016. Now President Biden won by roughly 154,000 votes in 2020. But I think the message is still that if this is a close election, then that margin of victory or that margin of 10,000 could actually make a difference. If not, you know, they could potentially also secure more uncommitted votes. And really what it is again, a warning sign to President Biden and the White House that they need to change course in their handling of the war and do a lot more to try and reassure this community and get more, reaffirm their support with a community that in past elections has predominantly voted for Democrats.
Yeah, it could be a real warning to Biden and also potentially a humbling moment for the president if those numbers are sizable. So, Sabrina, let's take the other side of this then. So what does the president and his campaign staff, how are they going to address this in the aftermath of today's election? How will they reach out to the community, and how do they hope to repair things by November?
Well, it's been a bit of a problem because last month, the Biden campaign dispatched its campaign manager to meet with some local Arab American leaders. And Julie Chavez Rodriguez, the Biden campaign manager, was rebuffed by many local elected officials. So in recent weeks, you actually saw some top foreign policy and national security officials from the Biden administration sit down and have a conversation. Now, the biggest problem is that these voters are not looking for a shift in tone. They're looking for a shift in policy. So what I often have heard from them is they don't want to talk about the politics. They don't want to talk about, how they're going to vote in November so much as what is the president going to do to bring about what they want, which is a permanent ceasefire in this war, as well as, the U.S. no longer sending military aid to Israel, at least in the course of this conflict. And that's something that this administration is not really prepared to do. I mean, the president is pushing for a temporary ceasefire, and he said last night that he hopes there will be one by Monday. But we're not expecting a significant shift in the U.S. Support for Israel in this war. And so, what the lasting impact of that is going to be with this community is still untold. Again, I think the Biden campaign is trying to draw a contrast with former President Trump, a lot of his inflammatory rhetoric and policies toward Muslim and Arab Americans. But it's just not clear that drawing that contrast is going to be enough when, you know, these voters are, I think, really frustrated by and disappointed with President Biden's posture, especially as the death toll in Gaza has neared 30,000 people, most of whom are civilians.
Yeah, you make a great point here. As we'll get into a little later in the show, the president has hopes of a ceasefire coming, and certainly those around his reelection bid hope that the war in Gaza will fade from the headlines by November. But will this population in Michigan and other places sort of forgive and move on and come back to the president? That's the open question. Terrific stuff to start us off this morning. White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Sabrina Siddiqui. Sabrina, thank you. We'll talk to you again soon.